Now by microwave, Prime Minister Pearson in Ottawa speaks with Charles Templeton in Toronto.
Mr. Turner, just one second. You do not have a monopoly on patriotism. And I resent the fact that your implication that only you are a Canadian.
You still prefer quiet diplomacy rather than this?
I prefer quiet diplomacy. Otherwise, diplomacy is quiet. Otherwise, it may not be diplomacy.
We built a country, east and west and north. We built it on an infrastructure that deliberately resisted the continental pressure of the United States. For 120 years, we've done it with one signature of a pen. You've reversed that.
Kryptos. Good morning.
Good morning. Yeah.
Welcome to you and to the audience to the first full episode of the podcast of the Red Ensign, a podcast which is focused on Canada, a people, its history, its culture, its prospects, its politics. I'm glad to have you here today. I'm as a co-host and a special contributor.
Well, I'm glad to be here. I'm excited about this project. It's one of those things where until you actually really look closely at it, as we have been doing in the weeks leading up to this episode, that just really how there isn't the kind of political commentary in Canada that has been happening for years now south of the border. And so we have been engaging with many of those people, made friends online and stuff. And recent events have led us to say, we really should take the skills we've been learning, as I said on Twitter, as mercenaries south of the border in their narrative wars, and apply them to the Canadian context. And because there really isn't anything other than like standard news and what we pejoratively call slop, there really isn't a whole lot of commentary on politics from a political theory conscious and political history conscious point of view. That is, as I think your term that you use is kind of value neutral. I mean, we're generally conservative and right wing here, but
we also have clear eyes, right?
That's right. Responsible analysis means sometimes stepping back from what you might deem as policy prescriptions. Just look at like, how do things work and why are things happening the way they're happening? And I think there's not really a lot of it is engagement bait. And
there's a couple layers to the Canadian political ecosystem. There's like the mainstream news layer, which is just a pure propaganda layer, literally paid for by the federal government in most instances.
Almost totally.
There's the slop layer, which is like rebel news, and there's a whole collection of these people who are farming outrage for cash via clicks.
Fear porn.
Yeah, that's a layer that exists. And then there's this weird kind of left-wing academic, more serious layer that exists in official Canadian news with shows like The Agenda from Steve Pagan and all of those kinds of stuff. The old like TVO broadcast that used to have Jordan Peterson on in the middle of the night.
Yeah.
That exists.
Ideas on CBC, which actually, all things considered, can be a pretty good show sometimes.
Well, it's better than the other two in some ways, but it is very not value neutral, right?
No,
no. It comes from a very particular perspective, and it's time we had something of our own.
But some of the commentators, to be fair, are like those old school leftists that you understood them to be left wing, but they were left wing in a kind of a responsible academic manner.
That's right. But it's time we had something of our own. The responsible left-wing academic is a dying breed. And even if it wasn't a dying breed, it's not a reflection of us, our people, our nation, our future. And so we decided to kind of push this project. It's been on the back burner for a while. And hopefully our audience enjoys it. And hopefully we can do a lot more shows in the future and have some of the other people working responsibly in this space to join us. If you're listening to this, viewing this later, in the comments below, either on Substack or on YouTube or wherever else, recommend people that you would like to see on, or topics that you would like to see discussed. We have some ideas of our own, but we're very open at this point to some recommendations.
And also because you and I now, because of the way things have sort of played out in terms of the development of our Twitter and Substack accounts, is that we have a fairly sizable, both of us, American audience. And so there's also the dual function of educating our friends south of the border on, Canada looks like basically the same country as America, but it's not really. And there's a lot of similarities, but there's also a lot of differences that I think are not always understood, as Trump's recent tariff boondoggle
Engagement,
underscore.
right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, before we dive into all of that, there's kind of three topics we were going to go through here. Two short ones: the Ontario election, the status of federal politics, and then we're going to dive into our main topic, which will review the Laurentian Elite and their long history with globalism. But first, why don't we talk a little bit about the Ontario election? Ontario is the largest province in Canada for our non-Canadian viewers, and it is having an early election. What is the official narrative of why we're having an early election?
I think Doug Ford looked at it as a way to consolidate power, for one.
Yeah.
But
that's like
impetus.
That's like the cynical narrative. What's his excuse?
The stated impetus for the election was to have a mandate from the Ontario public to negotiate tariffs and so forth with other provinces and with the Americans, to give him a real solid public mandate in the new realities that have come up since Trump has been elected and turned the eye of Sauron northward.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because provincial governments aren't really supposed to negotiate tariffs.
They're not.
Even at the level of the official narrative is just like baldly incoherent. And so we have the election in order to produce a new mandate for Doug Ford. Very likely, Doug Ford, the progressive conservative, are they the progressive conservatives provincially, or are they the CPC?
They're still PC in Ontario, yeah. So progressive, which is another unique Canadianism, that you can be both progressive and conservative at the same time.
Yes. So we have the progressive conservatives led by Doug Ford, who are overwhelmingly likely to win this election. We then have the Liberals. I think it's Bonnie Crombie, who's the
which says everything, that you don't even know who the leader is.
Yeah, I have not seen a single Liberal sign anywhere. The election's like, what, 2 weeks away now, and I've seen
Thursday.
Yeah, I've seen like a half a dozen PC signs and maybe like 2 or 3 Green Party signs. I haven't seen a single sign for either the NDP or the Liberal Party, or the Liberal Party led by Crombie.
No, and it turns out, although Doug Ford has been doing so well, that I live in just the area of where I live is actually a safe NDP seat, or it has been for eons. But it turns out, it looks like in both the Ontario and the federal, that my riding is tightening up, largely because it's mostly working class.
Yeah.
And the working class has been abandoning the NDP to move rightward, because they don't see the NDP anymore as actually looking out for their interests, whereas they're much more in tune. The conservatives in the working class mindset seem much more aligned with where the workers are these days.
This is actually a really good point. So if you kind of break down the 3 main parties in the Ontario election, they have 3 kind of what I would call political formulas that they're bringing forward. The political formula brought forward by the progressive conservatives under Doug Ford is that we're going to bulldoze large swaths of Ontario farmland and Ontario greenland, build houses and get them paid for by people from other places. right? So people from other places are going to come. They're going to dump money into the Canadian economy in order to buy houses on bulldozed agricultural land. That's his plan. And interestingly, this is actually quite appealing to
Well,
working class Canadians because it means lots of demand for trades workers, right? Because if you're going
that's
to
right.
build
And it also lowers
300,000
housing
houses,
costs.
yeah, if you're going to build like 300,000
Um,
houses, that's 300,000 carpenters and 300,000 plumbers and whatever else, right?
and let's see, and this is the thing that, the Doug, of course, as I explained to a liberal friend of mine recently, he says, you're going to vote for Doug Ford with all of the corruption. And when I explained to him, I said, well, okay, when liberals do it, corruption is called saving the world, and
Yeah.
when conservatives do it, it's just plain old corruption.
Right.
But it basically is so more or less. Doug Ford is, again, it's largesse for his supporters, and many of his bigger supporters are real estate developers. I mean, even here in our family, we have been longtime members of the Ontario Science Centre, a beautiful property in the Don Valley, that and one of the few brutalist buildings that's actually nice to
Yeah,
be
it's an
around, because it's actually
actual cool example of brutalist architecture.
that works.
Yeah.
But that, because the site was viewed as very valuable for high-end real estate, for no reason the building was condemned and then sold. The land is being sold off to this. So we're still kind of annoyed. But so I said, well, you're annoyed at that, but you're going to vote for Ford. And I said, wow, the alternatives are worse. And that's really, that's basically what a lot of Canadian politics is. You vote for one form of corruption to avoid worse corruption from the other two parties.
Well, let's go through the other two political formulas on offer from our esteemed mainstream Ontario political parties. We've got the Ontario Liberals, who, correct me if I'm wrong, their political formula seems to be that we're going to take your tax money and pay like green activists to make us build wind farms or something.
Well, yeah, and we're going to buy off the healthcare, because again,
we're going to dump money into education and healthcare in order to pay those unions off. So if you're like in the education union, or if you're in the nurses union or something, you're going to vote for the Liberals because they're going to give you a pay raise.
That's right. And so for those like south of the border, Canadian system, the provinces are responsible for healthcare and education. And so the federal government sometimes makes transfer payments to sort of, in good socialist fashion, to equal out the wealth across the country, which again is one of these things that annoys Albertans. And so you get these, what you would call as block grants to Ontario, but it's really the Ontario provincial government that then administers the healthcare system. It
manages the patronage network, so it figures out exactly where the money goes. And so all of these little constituents who are paid by the government are all part of this Liberal governing formula in Ontario, where they figure, if I elect Team Red under Bonnie Crombie, she's going to give me more money. So that's their political formula.
That's right. And then the Conservatives are branded as hostile to healthcare. Did you see the new advertise? I don't know whether it's Liberal or NDP, the one where they have the patients sitting out in the parking lot.
Oh my goodness.
And they go like, what happens when there's no more room in the hallways? And then you have a patient sitting out in the parking lot and they're parked with an IV stuck in there. I just had to laugh because the commercial, you almost want to vote Conservative just to see it happen.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's, I don't know if you remember this, but there's this great series of ads from the mid 90s that were at the federal level at the time, where they were trying to scare Canadians about American healthcare, and they show a patient being rushed through the hospital, and his condition is he has money up the wazoo. So this is like an old standard Canadian propaganda technique that if we don't pay the nurses slightly more money, you're all gonna die, basically.
Well, and that's it, right? So yeah, so that's therefore. So then you get to Marit Stiles and NDP, and they're more or less limousine liberals, academics.
I read their like all their documentation on their website because I was trying to figure out if they're still a real party. And as far as I can tell, they're really not a real party.
No.
They've got people who vote for them based on the idea that they're like 1980s style union people. None of the people in the party are 1980s style union people.
No, they're all teachers and
Yeah,
former bureaucrats.
It's very female coded, the whole party, and it's very. I can't figure out how one becomes like a candidate for the NDP because none of the candidates look anything like the people who vote for them.
Well, at the federal level, and if somebody really wants to do some research, they can find this
the federal level is different.
Approximate.
The federal NDP is an ethnic party. I understand ethnic parties, but the provincial NDP is not an ethnic party. All their candidates are like 50-year-old white women who claim to be fighting for the working class, but actually their credentials are all like advancing some LGBTQ whatever
Masters of Education. So none of them have PhDs. They're all master's degree holders. But so in my writing, like at the federal level, it was literally passed down from mother to daughter. And so and in many cases, that's often how the NDP candidates show up at the
as far as I can tell
level.
They're very rapidly becoming not a serious party in political politics, in provincial politics.
And provincial politics also, again, because of the ethnic component, it is really the Liberals that are being co-opted by ethnic interests.
Yeah, that's right.
When you look at sort of what you would call traditional sort of European ancestry,
well,
by far the Conservatives have
the Conservatives the Conservatives are the white party because in Ontario the overwhelming majority of white men are tied to the real estate development thing, right? That's how they make their money.
That's right.
And so that's kind of or they're part of what I call the Old Blue Coalition, which is the like socially conservative part of the PC coalition. And these people are very angry. They're very disaffected, but there are actual like social conservatives in rural Ontario that are not part of the real estate grift.
And that's a big thing, and to understand too that in Canada the urban rural divide is significant, like really, really significant. Almost every urban center. Although this election, there's more seats up in play than there has been in the past, but you could almost go into any urban center and they are all either Liberal or NDP seats. And once you get outside the city limits, they're almost entirely blue, which is the proper color for Conservatives.
Yeah. Well, but the point I want to drive here is that Doug Ford's progressive Conservatives, because they've got this formula around real estate development, they're not limited to traditional rural social conservatives. They've got this whole other class of people who vote for them.
But and it's sort of what they would call the in Toronto parts, like the 911 area. So you have the 416, 905. Oh, shoot, 911. Yeah, the 905, the 905 area. And because I'm in 519, which is more of the outside outlying. And then, but you have the 905, which is that ring around the 416, which is the old Toronto.
Yeah, and 905 is where every election in Canada is typically decided.
That's right. And
the progressive Conservatives at the moment have a total lock on it in Canadian politics.
That's right.
The real estate grift is way more effective at delivering money to people who might vote for them than the payout through healthcare and education formula that the Liberals are trying to kind of put forward.
But it's also sort of exposing a small internal conflict within the Conservative formula, because surrounding Toronto is what's called a green belt. At least traditionally, that's what it. So I forget when that came in. What is it?
Oh, it's
late 80s, early 90s.
80s.
But they developed a development so that all development was supposed to occur within the development boundary, sort of infill development, and basically They would not go outside of the green belt until pretty much every scrap of land inside that developed, almost what they did in Portland, Oregon, where you create that ring and you limit development. So then this allowed all of that farmland. It's the green belt's a fairly significantly wide area. Like to the north,
it's a huge area.
Yeah, to the north, it includes like Holland Marsh, which is like really valuable farmland. But Holland Marsh, proximity-wise, is only like, what, 10 minutes away from, Canada's Wonderland, which is right now, it's been swallowed by the city. So these areas that are...
The political formula he's proposing is bulldoze the green belt, which is some of the most prosperous farmland anywhere in the world, and put housing for the third world on it. That's what he's proposing to do.
And he somehow managed to get away with it.
Well, he's going to get away with it because it's going to produce a huge amount of money for all the people who are interested in voting for him.
And they're all in the 905. And so the people in the 519 and what is it, the 7, whatever, north of the city.
705, yeah.
705, north of the city. All of those people can kind of just, whatever, vote Liberal if you want, but we know you're going to vote for us anyway, so screw you.
Well, so you've gotten these couple of splinter parties, which are ideologically, some combination of ideologically conservative and just people who hate Doug Ford. And I count myself as a person who hates Doug Ford. There's plenty of reasons to hold animus there. So you've got the Ontario Party and you have New Blue. New Blue, the name implies, is like explicitly, let's do a conservative party, but actually conservative, and will not have Doug Ford as the head of it. And we've got the Ontario Party, which is like, let's clone the People's Party at the federal level and have politics on behalf of people who actually believe in the founding values of Ontario, something like that.
Yeah, and I think this is a number of different things where people don't understand how politics in Canada really work. That in many ways the politics of Canada are not really ideological in many ways.
Yeah, so the ideological positions of the progressive conservatives, the Liberals, and the NDP are virtually identical. I was chatting to my wife about the election, and she said to me something like, I want us to vote not Liberal because I want to see less people gender transition, basically. And I pointed out, like, mandatory gender transition, including taking children from parents, is happening, and it began under the progressive conservatives. There's like total ideological unity between the three, between the NDP, the Liberals, and the progressive conservatives. It's just these fringe parties that represent other ideas about issues besides how you're going to distribute the patronage.
And it's funny because Canada, being loyalist, has a fundamentally sort of conservative disposition about societal governance, and that doesn't really go away even with the ideology. Canada tends to be very statist, and it tends to trust governing institutions, and it tends to, like, peace, order, and good government. We need a good government. We need it to be there. And there's a general, like, a trust of government, almost too trusting of government. So in terms of the ideological leftism, this really emerges in part because of the ties back to old world Europe, but then also the connection that old world Europe has to sort of blue America. And blue America exists in part to keep the redneck America out of power, right? And so there's a whole
podcast there about the invention of Canada and how Canada became a colony of blue America ideologically. But that's
another thing. But in Ontario, like much Canadian politics, so a lot, this is kind of one of my pet theories about what I call sort of the oscillation theory, because as you noted, the Liberals have their support base, the Conservatives have their support base, and both of them are patronage networks. And so what happens is you get a ruling party in power for 8 to 12 years, until such a point as the corruption of their patronage gets so obvious and so corrupt that it's unavoidably noticeable, and even their supporters begin to get angry. And then so what happens is their supporters flip over to the other major party and say, well, let's give them a try. And then they get in their patronage network, and they hang around until their corruption gets so out of hand that you then have to flip back to the other party. And so you basically get at both the federal and the provincial level this oscillation between liberal and conservative, not based on ideology, but based on which one is the least corrupt at the moment.
Well, I mean, federal politics is different because
it does have some difference.
Yeah, provincial politics is really like this, and federal politics prior to about 1970 is like this, where you have two parties in ideological unity, and it's just a kick the bums out of the seats mentality, where at a certain point a sitting party is deemed too corrupt, and so it's replaced by another party that believes the same things, that hopefully does peace, order, and good governance better.
Yeah, balance the budget, make sure you don't tax so much, and the ideal and like the platonic ideal of Canadian politics is that you never see your politicians. They're not in the news. You don't know they're there, and they're not doing anything radical. And so the more that you are in the news in Canadian politics, the worse it is.
Yeah.
And that's why in some ways, like a lot of us as Canadians, if we love politics, you kind of end up getting tuned into American politics because American politics is a blood sport. And Canadian politics is very different in that regard.
Yeah, there's whole layers to this, but I mean, Canadian politics is both more real and more like most people who get interested in politics are interested in what I call the kayfabe. It's the whole, it's the show, right?
Yeah, the parties and the platforms and the personalities and so forth.
And the big the big speeches, the big newsy events, all this kind of stuff. But the beating heart of politics is competing patronage. It's competing governing formulas. It's all of this stuff, which is actually much more real in Canadian politics. Like the difference between the progressive conservatives and their political formula and the Liberal Party of Ontario and their governing formula is profound from a pure politics point of view, but it's not exciting.
No, and you can often in say big name Toronto law firms, you can sort of say which law firms are liberal law firms and which law firms are conservative law firms.
That's right.
And the patronage flows. And so which banking houses are liberal banking houses and which banking houses are conservative banking houses?
Yeah, unfortunately, I can answer that for you. All the banking houses are liberal banking houses. Every single one.
They are now, yes. But you used to be able to evaluate like a law firm in Toronto based on, which party that they were generally aligned with. And it used to be that the banks kind of aligned differently as well too. Like
in Ontario politics, it's still a bit that way. Federal politics is a bit different.
Not so much.
But I think we've beaten the provincial election a bit.
The Conservatives are going to win by like 18 points.
Yeah,
the official, and that's why it's really a non-event.
The official endorsement of the Red Ensign podcast is vote for somebody in your riding who's going to be the best, because none of the parties who are going to significantly change anything are going to win. So
it's it's brutal in my riding because they're both in play, both at the federal and provincial level. They're in play now.
Yeah,
I can't do a vanity. I have to be careful. As it used to be, I could always just do a vanity vote because it didn't matter because the NDP were just going to get elected by 15 points. And now that the election, my riding's actually in play, it's maybe I actually have to, do the thing where I maybe just hold my nose and vote PC because, again, the alternatives are worse.
I mean, my riding is going to be like one of those Alberta federal ridings where there's
80% conservative.
Yeah. I mean, there's a riding I like to look at in Alberta on election night, because I always want to see if they can get past the 95 mark. And my ridings could be a bit like that. I do know that there's one person in my neighborhood who's going to vote for the Green Party, and I met an actual real live New Blue voter the other day.
Wow.
Which is, I've never met a New Blue voter before in my life. So anyways, we'll see. So the next topic I wanted to talk about briefly, and maybe we'll just cover this briefly. It's in the news today. The the Liberal Party of Canada in the federal polls has now completely closed the 30 to 35 point lead that the Conservative Party previously held. Polls aren't really news, but we just gotta take a lap here and say this is the Donald Trump tariff effect.
Yes.
The rally around the flag for the Laurentian Elite is real. It's profound. It has changed the dynamic of Canadian politics dramatically. And thank you, Donald Trump. If we get Mark Carney, it will be your fault, and I will keep reminding you of that. So,
but yeah, it's Canadians love America, love the U.S. They love Americans for the most part, but one of the things that defines Canadians is that they're not Americans, and that's kind of, so when you're.
But it's not just that. Like, you threaten to annex a country, you're going to get a political response. That's just
exactly
the way it is. And so in the US, they're much more used to this kind of flamboyant news where, there's big headlines and then you watch what actually happens. Canadians are not like this. When our government says they're going to do something, they do it. Even if it's insane, they do it.
They do it. Yeah, people don't realize that basically we vote in. If you have a majority government, you basically have a dictatorship for 4 or 5 years.
Yeah,
and there's no checks or balances, like none.
I remember I was in New York City during COVID for a while, and the COVID lockdowns in New York City, the city was theoretically hard lockdown, and it was a total joke. Like, restaurants were open, people were socializing, nobody treated it seriously. The only evidence of lockdown was like the Metro Transit Authority people would announce it over the speakers constantly, and occasionally some like city worker would yell at you for not wearing a mask. Lockdowns in Ontario were like lockdowns in China. You would have thought that the Ontario government was pointing a gun at everybody's head. It was just, I mean, they locked up the tennis courts near my house. They took away the basketball hoops so that kids wouldn't be able to go outside and play.
Well, there's still like holdover stuff that it's kind of insane. But yeah, and
I used to drive by a local school and watch all the kids at recess stand
with
masks on outside, sitting 6 feet apart next to the wall, but only 6 feet apart so they could still talk to each other. And then the teachers would all stand watching them against the wall and observe if they, impinged on each other's bubbles. So when the government of Canada says that it's going to do something, for right or for wrong, crazy or sane, they do it.
Yeah, and to see, people don't realize this, but once you get outside of the U.S., most people consider Barack Obama to be among the greatest American presidents.
For goodness
right?
sake.
And so, like my father, who has voted conservative his whole life, been involved in politics his whole life, in his 80s now, said, we're planning on taking a trip out west with my parents. They're in their 80s now, and they asked us, hey, let's go on a road trip together. And I said, so are we going to go around the south or the north of the Great Lakes to get out west? And my dad says, well, we're going to go around the north. You can't drive through the states with Donald Trump in charge now. And there is a surprising number of people where conservative voters, for whom it is a very real question, and this is a very real politically calculated question in their minds, is now the right time to vote conservative? Because who do we believe will be better able to stand up to Donald Trump?
Yeah, exactly.
And that is a real live question in Canadian politics, and on the ground, like, you'll get it unsolicited from people who that's like the first thing that comes out of their mouth in terms of their political calculations.
It's on everybody's lips for federal politics. But I don't want to spend more time on this, but to note the effect, it's real.
Yeah, and I'm not sure how real it is though, too, and how much of those numbers are skewed from like Toronto.
As we get towards the federal election, we will have to kind of follow this a bit more closely, because we were on the precipice of the federal Liberal Party collapsing as a political institution.
Almost as bad as the time they went down to 2 seats.
Oh, it would have changed Canadian politics forever.
Yeah, remember when the NDP were the official opposition?
Well, so, but again, that was in the before times when the Conservative Party of Canada wasn't a representative of the Western elite. They were a representative of just part of the Laurentian elite. But in today's dynamics, the destruction of the Liberal Party would leave the Laurentian elite without a vehicle in formal politics, which I'm not even sure I can formulate exactly how that transformation would look, but it would be profound. Now that's not going to happen.
They would probably glom on. So this is, I guess, goes back to, like, there's a long history in the Conservative Party, because the Liberals have remained largely the Liberals and who they are for a long, long time. But the Conservatives got broken up with Reform, over Western discontent, and then over Quebec nationalism. The main impetus for the Bloc Québécois came out of the Progressive Conservative Party, and so the Bloc Québécois and Reform decimated the Conservatives.
There's a whole episode here to talk about the reinvention of the Conservative Party. As a representative of the Western elite, rather than as first a fragment of the Laurentian elite, then like an ideological party for a time under Reform, and then like a true representative of the Western elite in the institution of the Conservative Party of Canada. But we've never had a situation where the Conservative Party of Canada, as an instrument of the Western elite, has had a real hold on federal politics for any extended period of time. Even
with Stephen Harper, it was more illusory than real.
Well, they had one majority term, and during that majority term, they had a slim majority, and it was running out the clock on their majority term because of the changes in politics in the American Empire. So like a real Conservative Party of Canada win would have changed elite politics in Canada in a way that's kind of hard to express.
Yeah.
But now that's not going to happen. So I suppose we don't need to contemplate it.
Like, except within the Conservative Party, there has always been that, like the Conservative Party of Canada, because I was active in electoral politics during the melding of the PC and Reform to form the Progressive, or the Conservative Party of Canada, CPC. And one of the real concerns always was, will Ontario Conservatives, which are basically that sort of fragment of the Laurentian elite, will they co-opt the vibrant conservatism of the Western interests? And I think largely the result has been, for the most part, yes, but not entirely. And that's why you've got, I think,
if you look at the Conservative Party of Canada, there's 3 factions fighting over it.
Yes.
You have the Alberta elite, the Western elite, who are in a commanding position in that party right now. You have the ideological and religious conservatives who come from Blue Ontario and sort of parts of rural Canada, and they've never been able to grab control of that party. And then you have like the 905 marginal conservatives from Ontario who have fought back and forth with the Western elite over control of that party since before that party even existed. And for the most part, the Western elite have won that battle. But it would be interesting in a world where there were a lot more MPs from Ontario, whether the Alberta elite would be able to kind of keep control. It's not obvious to me what the answer to that question would be.
Yeah, and it's not always like the tensions are there between Ontario and Alberta, and they remain beneath the surface all the time, because the idea that, Bay Street, which is sort of the equivalent of Wall Street, that the idea that Bay Street would have, be able to set the tone of the agenda is anathema to your basic voter in Edmonton or Calgary. And
well, not
and
just your
that's
basic voter, like these
but
are
the power
actually,
interests.
that's right. So when so I'm very familiar with the Bay Street world, um, and very familiar with the elite interests in Alberta. But the two groups hate each other
They do.
almost as much as Quebec nationalists hate Anglo Canadians. Maybe more actually right now. Right now, anti-Anglo sentiment in Quebec it's not tinged with the kind of rage it was in like the 70s and 80s. It's kind of different. But we are coming up to 10 minutes left, and we haven't talked about our main topic at all. So let's see if we can get to this a little bit. So we've talked a little bit about the elite factions in Canada. The overwhelmingly dominant elite faction in Canadian politics at the federal level, well, at every level, has been the Laurentian Elite. Every level except Quebec politics, and the Laurentian Elite has a long history with global institutions, and Justin Trudeau, who is kind of a cutout for the Laurentian Elite in Canadian politics, is also a cutout for Team Globalist, and it's not a coincidence. It's been that relationship between the Laurentian Elite and globalism has existed for a very long time. And I think it's kind of interesting to explore why. So if you let me kind of lay out the history here for a minute, and then we'll talk about where we are at present. This relationship goes back to the late 50s and a period known as the invention of Canada, where Canada passed from its previous instantiation as a British colonial asset to become an American colonial asset. And in that transition, the Laurentian elite were able to secure their power as the dominant elite coalition in Canada by attaching themselves to Blue America. But in so doing, they intended for the international institutions that Blue America was setting up all over the world to be their counterbalance to sort of low imperialism from the Americans. And you see this for many years. Canada is a big player in like UN peacekeeping and all of this kind of very signally stuff that goes on throughout the late 60s, 70s, and early 80s. Canada always is part of every UN peacekeeping mission from like 1960 through to maybe 2000. And it's part of the commitment of the Laurentian elite to these international institutions that they believe are going to counterbalance the weight of kind of low American imperialism in the country. Maybe even more so after the breakdown of the trade barriers in the late 80s, where no longer did they have kind of their own economic interests to counterbalance American influence. They really come to rely on like these international green things, the UN Court of Human Rights, all of these kind of all of these very globalist institutions. And the intent here is to preserve their source of power as against their competitors who are leveraging the economic relationship with America to produce economic power. So that's kind of the history that kind of gets us to here. And now we have this situation where a local elite is also a globalist elite.
Yeah, and the poster child of that era would have to be, Lester B. Pearson, who was, Prime Minister of Canada, then the Secretary General of the United Nations, and also the ambassador to the United States for years and years. So, well, for a number of years, anyways.
Well,
It's
and in typically Laurentian Elite style, he plays up his value as part of these international institutions profoundly.
yes.
So in that intro, there's a short clip from Lester B. Pearson discussing quiet diplomacy. This is part of a much larger interview in which he takes credit for settling the Suez crisis between the British Empire and the United States. Now, this is a narrative every Canadian is taught in public school, that we were instrumental, and without Lester B. Pearson, there would have been like a nuclear war over Suez or something. As far as I can tell, looking at the primary sources, there is no truth whatsoever in this narrative.
No, there isn't. And the funny thing is that this maintains the kind of mythos of, Canada sort of being on the edge of, like, the G7, G8 countries, right? So you're the small junior partner. But the image that Canada has sort of put forward, and the propaganda that goes out to us as Canadians, is that we are the small, inoffensive junior partner to all of these larger global players. We are the one that is well respected on the world here. We're all like Lester B. Pearson. We're the country that people count on to sort of broker the deals between all of the larger parties when they can't get the deals done. And that's kind of the image that we have been sold about the role of this. It's almost like,
the role of Canada.
Why does Canada exist? Well, Canada exists to be that figure behind the scenes that's brokering the pieces everywhere around the globe that otherwise would never happen. And this is kind of the image that we get of what Canada is.
And from a political point of view, this formula actually works extremely well in its inception. So if you look at this as a political formula in the 60s and 70s for Canada, it's a very effective way of selling Canadians their insignificance. Right?
Well, but not only that, but explaining, like, why do we have military service, all of these sorts of things, like, why don't we just let the Americans protect us, these types of things, and do what the Europeans are doing and create it. Well, we need a military because we have to maintain our peacekeeping obligations,
but
right? And that's the whole purpose of the military, is peacekeeping obligations.
Yeah, but basically from 1960 to 2000, this is a great way to do nothing in particular and sell Canadians like their own pride back to them. But there's a moment when in maybe the early 90s, it's hard for me to localize this exactly, but there's a moment when you transition from these like profoundly insignificant impacts of this globalist network to the globalist network getting the idea that it should actually govern and doing significant things that are also stupid, right? So sometime in the 90s, this global network decided that in addition to pretending to peacekeep across the world, it should influence all of its component countries to accept mass migration. There's a moment in the late 90s where it decides that in addition to whatever fake things it's doing, it should influence all of its constituent countries to go through a quote-unquote energy transition and make electricity overwhelmingly more expensive for everyone and cripple the industrial economies of all its component states. And so, while this was low cost at first, in the subsequent years, this kind of this political formula goes from being kind of cost-free, fan the vanity of Canadians, to this profoundly expensive thing, profoundly expensive vanity project of the Laurentian Elite. And that is one aspect of the Canada that we live in today. We've got this, we're paying enormous costs for this vanity project of being part of these global institutions.
Well, excuse me. Well, and it it mirrors in many ways some of the things that you see, say, happening in Germany. And so Canada has to set
Germany is
itself.
another example of a country where the affiliation with the global network has profound domestic costs. Right.
So
there's lots of them.
So the way that it gets put forward is that Canada needs to be a global leader. So this is in contrast to, especially, again, everything always comes back to the Americans.
To Red America, which is the global laggard, the one we all kind of love to dug on, right?
Well, but the thing is that it's not just any Red America. It's that.
Well, it's the propaganda caricature of Red America.
That it's the Hick South, it's the hillbillies, it's the Texas oil guys. It's all of these negative characteristics or caricatures that you have. And so, the American elite are seen supposedly, this is kind of Obama as the shining star, that they're the ones that are keeping down all of these dangerous American nationalist, forces. And so, as part of this quest to keep down, the sort of the worst aspects of Red America, the Republicans play their part, the Democrats play their part, but Canada, we are going to be a global leader, and we're really going to show them how it's done. And that's and so in many ways, Canadians become even more American than Americans.
Yeah,
and this is kind of an observation made that okay, so Obama is progressive, but we're here to show Obama how it's done and how you can really do it. So if Obama wants a template, he can come to Canada.
Even our conservatives are progressive conservatives, right?
That's right. And we're showing them how, what it means to be part of the global community. And we've set nationalism behind us. And so again, immigration, mass immigration is then built off of that same propaganda foundation, that we are part of the global community. And so then, you have to allow yourself to be flooded by the Chinese, flooded by the Indians, flooded by this country, that country, until such a point where you have to even wonder anymore, is there such a thing as a Canadian identity? I mean, it's still there, I think. I mean, I live out in the hinterlands of Ontario, and it's very much, it's all around me, right? But
there's layers to this, right? You've just described the propaganda aspect of the affiliation with the international institutions, but there's also a political interest aspect to it, right? So in the 1960s, you had a free propaganda win, and you kind of were able to advance some political interest by making some patronage appointments. And on top of that, you got some investment back from these international institutions. And for the most part, it was like a straight up deal. The Laurentian elite got political legitimacy. In return, they made token contributions, and everybody was happy. Fast forward to 2000, you have mass immigration and green, and you're being asked to pay this enormous cost in exchange for political legitimacy. So from an interest point of view, this formula is breaking for the Laurentian elites, but they don't abandon it, they double down on it. And because they
triple down on it.
Doubling and tripling down on it is part of what breaks the politics of Canada. In future episodes, we'll talk about the fracturing of the Canadian Laurentian elite from the sort of through the 90s and into the early 2000s. But as they double and triple down on it, it just keeps getting more and more expensive. So extracting political legitimacy from the globalist narrative is way more expensive during COVID in 2020 than it was in 2010, and way more expensive in 2010 than it was in 2005, when most of the green commitments were kind of fake, and way more expensive in 2005 than it was in 1985, when most of the mass immigration commitments were kind of fake. So you can see this escalating cost with very little, and then the return is interesting, because what they were supposed to get in terms of interests, in terms of return, was they were supposed to get a set of institutions that could balance the the low interests of the United States. But this is why this is the part of globalism that I call globalism as cope for the impotent Canadian government. So a classic example of this is the softwood lumber dispute. If you look this up, there's like a 30-year history of legal cases between Canada and the US over softwood lumber. The fight is about whether or not the practice of making logging companies pay for clear-cutting land is fairly administered between Canada and the United States. And there are tariffs that get applied intermittently to try to address the perceived unfairness. So as part of NAFTA, Canada got a bunch of administrative courts, the World Trade Organization and so on, which were supposed to administer disputes between the two nations. Canada has won repeatedly in these arbitration bodies, and yet the United States has imposed tariffs when they believed it was appropriate anyway, in just total disregard for the international institutions. So I think a lot of the political tools that the Laurentian elite thought they were buying with globalism have just been cope, right? They've just been illusory. It turns out it doesn't matter how many times you vote against the United States in the United Nations. It doesn't make a damn bit of difference. It doesn't matter how many cases you win in the World Trade Organization. They're going to behave the way they're going to behave. And so this whole, the whole predicate to buying into these international institutions to try to counterbalance the interests of Americans in Canadian politics, it's fallen completely flat. And I don't understand. I just don't understand why the Laurentian elite, in their own interest, keep doubling down on it.
I think it comes down to it, and this is in a sense where there's an ideological component that you see.
Yeah.
And you see this also in the American left as well too, in this thing called the rules-based order.
Yeah.
So the idea is in the rules-based order that hard power doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And so in a sense, the idea was that you could counterbalance American hard power with the rules-based order, and that if we appealed to them, again, it comes back to the Lester B. Pearson thing, if we can appeal to them quietly through diplomacy, they will come around and they will see that the rules-based order is the correct way to manage global affairs, and the Americans will be brought properly into the global world order the way that everybody else is. And the problem is, America has carrier groups and tank battalions and 350 million people, and they don't need to come into the world order because they're the 600-pound gorilla everywhere they go. And so they don't need the rules-based order, and they just simply ignore it when it's in their interest to do so. And this is exactly what you should expect from a unipolar superpower, that they'll just do what they want to do. And Canada, since I don't know, I can still remember a time when the Canadian banking system was the model of the world, and sound banking policy, balanced budgets. They were still trying to achieve balanced budgets even the Liberal government was trying to achieve balanced budgets in the 90s and so forth. And so those types of policies, sort of the careful, judicious, safe administration of Canadian governments allowed you to weather the tempestuous nature of the 600-pound gorilla that lived next door. You just assumed that sooner or later they're going to notice that you were succeeding at something and impose a tariff on you. And so you always had to be ready for that with sound governance. And that has been really abandoned since 2000, probably, is, when you really began to notice it. And so now everything gets doubled down on, and the response of the Liberal government has, I think Stephen Harper in many ways kept the dam, just more or less was putting the finger in the dam, but then that got broken with, because I remember Stephen Harper, and there was a speech one time when after the 2008 crisis, and they said, well, what are you going to do about it? And I think his gut reaction as an economist was to say nothing.
Yeah.
It'll just sort itself out. And then I guess somebody pulled him aside and said, no, the banks have to be bailed out.
You can't say that. And in Canada,
because he actually did say it, nothing. And then got just roasted for 2 weeks or 3 weeks in the press over it.
Well, it's interesting because there weren't bank bailouts of any consequence in Canada, right? So all five
They
of our
didn't need
banks.
them.
That's right. But anyways, we're kind of up on time here.
Yeah.
So thank you for listening to the first episode of this podcast. Make sure you share it, like it, subscribe, whatever it is on the platform you happen to be enjoying. And I hope you're back with us for our next episode, which will be in about 2 weeks. Thank you very much for your time.
Canada originally was put together by two groups of people who didn't have much in common but didn't want to be American.
The line just popped into my head. A bunch of the boys was a-whooping it up. And there I got my start.
We have had a flag. Flags can be changed. But flags cannot be imposed, the sacred symbols of a people's hopes and aspirations, by the simple, capricious, personal choice of a Prime Minister of Canada.
I have watched this country for half of my life from abroad, and we have turned complacency into just that, a national sport.
I am resolutely opposed to all innovation, all change, but I am determined to understand what's happening. I don't choose just to sit and let the juggernaut roll over me.